Welcome to Chats from the Wine Cellar, the official inventory podcast. I am Eula Georgieva, and this week we are returning with a trade secrets episode. So the last time we did trade secrets, we had Charles Curtis talking about wine auctions. Charles was the former head of auctions at Christie's. This week we are turning to wine as an investment, but we do have another MW in the hot seat, Adam Lapierre. Adam, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Eula. Happy to be here.
We're excited to do this because wine investment is a pretty topical thing right now, and we're excited to learn everything you have to share. So I used to do intros on our guests, but I'm going to turn it right over to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came into the world of wine, got that MW next to your name, and also tell us a little bit about Vint, the investment company that you work for.
Yeah, happy to. Basically, I've worked in the wine business my entire adult life. I started working for a winery in upstate New York in the Finger Lakes region over 20 years ago, and didn't know much about wine, but was very interested. The winery was very commercially successful, but I wouldn't say considered at the top tier of quality. But what really ignited my interest and passion was the winemaker there, who was just so knowledgeable and generous with his time. I had spent a lot of time working in the cellar, in the vineyards, and out in the market. And it really just opened up how how broad the world of wine is and how it touches so many different areas of life. So from there, I was out in the market trying to sell these wines. Again, not the best quality, but when you're speaking to somms and buyers, found it sort of necessary to understand the world of wine so I could put these wines in context. So I started tasting more broadly and started the WSET program. Didn't have the ambition of becoming a master of wine, but just started doing the certificates, and with each subsequent milestone, wanted to tackle the next challenge. So my time at this winery, I obtained my WSET diploma, and at that point, for me, set my sights on the MW. At that point in time, I decided I needed to make a job change so that I was working with the types of wines that I would need to really understand in order to pass the MW. So I worked for an importer called Frederick Wildman and Sons, which represents 50 different estates, family-owned estates from around the world. So I got to work with some fantastic producers, and went through the MW program, which is a roller coaster process. It took me about 6 years from start to finish to attain the MW. Gets to this point where you're, you've invested so much time, energy, and money that you just can't turn back. So I powered through and got the MW, which was a great achievement in 2013, huge relief. And then after that, I went to the other side of the table. So as opposed to working on the supplier side, went to working in buying roles. I worked for a company called Lidl, which is one of the largest retailers in the world. I ran a company called Vint COO, which is focused on collectible fine wine. So the really most important wines from an investment and collectible perspective, working with consumers. And most recently joined the team here at Vint, which we've got two businesses. One is the main business is focused on wines and spirits as an investment. So we're a company that enables and facilitates fractional investment in the most interesting and coveted investment grade wines and spirits. And then we also have a marketplace where we sell the world's greatest wines and spirits direct to consumer.
Now I have to ask you, when you did the MW, did you meet Charles, and do you know Charles?
I do know Charles, yes. I first met him as a student. I've traveled to New York a number of times, and he was volunteering, leading some tasting sessions. So I got to engage with him in that regard. He would present at different seminars, and then spent some time with him since becoming an MW, working on educational programs. So in essence, the MW educational program is all run by Masters of Wine, who have subsequently are volunteering their time and helping the next group of students climb the mountains. So we spent a lot of time together at various seminars.
Well, we'll be sending him this episode too. I think this will be great that we have these next to each other as the trade secrets episodes. So turning back to Vint and wine as an investment, you mentioned fractional ownership. Maybe just explain what that means.
In 2012, this is really specific to the U.S. market, but certain rules were passed that enabled crowdfunding into crowdfunding for entities, for basically for startups. And this rule enabled companies to securitize and facilitate fractional investment in many different categories of asset classes. Vint is the only company that's really doing this type of process oriented towards fine wines and spirits. And in essence, what we do is we identify and source the greatest assets that we think have strong potential as investments. We securitize these. So we create individual LLCs. They're called series LLCs. So basically a mini company whose only role is to own and hold these assets. And then we qualify these offerings with the SEC, and that enables us to present these investment opportunities to individuals, and individuals can basically purchase shares in this series LLC, and by proxy, the assets that the LLC is holding. So as an example, we purchase and securitize a lot of DRC. Well, we might purchase a case of Romanée-Conti, a 3-pack of Romanée-Conti with a market value of $120,000, $100,000, whatever it may be. We qualify this with the SEC, and then we can present this investment opportunity on our platform, and folks can purchase as little as one share of this case of wine for $100. So get exposure to the top assets, but in a way that's quite capital efficient.
So fascinating. And as you said, I don't think there's anyone else out there doing it. So very novel model.
Yeah, I think, the founders of the company saw wine investing in the traditional sense of buying and holding these wines as a model that could be improved upon, or at least changed in a way to bring this asset class to a broader group of potential consumers. And when you think about efficient diversification in an asset class, you really most people wouldn't want to allocate more than 5% of the total pool that they're going to invest in this category to a single asset. So if you're thinking about that example of DRC at $100,000 a case, there's very few people that, would have a collection or an investment allocation towards wines and spirits large enough to have that make sense in a way that gives them that diversification. So it's a pretty clever approach to wines and spirit investing.
So now let's talk about wine as an asset class. It has gained traction, I think, in recent years as becoming a financial asset as opposed to just something that we all love and drink. So can you give us a sense of why that is? Why is it that wine has become seen as a financial asset, and what makes it a worthwhile financial asset?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the idea of investing in wine is more widespread in Europe, or has traditionally been more widespread in Europe, and in particular in the UK, where you've had this very strong global wine trade. And I think the old approach of, somebody that's a collector buying 2 cases of a wine on release, reselling one in a number of years' time when the price goes up, and using the profit from that sale to pay for the other case that they're going to drink, was sort of a normal approach that folks would take. In the U.S., it's always, I think, until just very recently, folks have just been very focused on consumption, wine for consumption. So even collectors that I have worked with that might have 20 or 30,000 bottles tended to have a very different view towards their collection, really not thinking of it in any way as an asset, but more as a passion project. And most collectors that I've engaged with wouldn't dream of selling any of their wines unless they until they reach the point where they realize they're just never going to come close to drinking all their holdings, and reality starts to set in. But otherwise, I feel like at least collectors that I've engaged with in the U.S. have a strong emotional attachment to collecting. As I think as the next generations of consumers are getting interested in wine, there is a bit of a bit less of an emotional attachment. So I think that younger collectors are kind of thinking about wine and spirits through both lenses, basically. One as an asset class for investing, and one as a product to enjoy and consume. And then I think the track record that wine and spirits have shown, in particular recently, has been pretty dynamic, and that's probably gotten the attention of a lot of folks. What's very interesting from our perspective is if you go back more than 100 years, Cambridge did a study over 120 years and looked at the performance of wine as an investment, and on average, it delivered 8% returns, above 8% returns over that 120-year period. So certainly we have had sort of explosive growth in the most recent number of years, but it does have a long track record of performance. And then the other advantage is that it's typically not correlated with other asset classes. So when stocks or bonds move in value, wine tends to be reasonably stable.
So looking at the two major economic crises we've had in the last 20 years, the global financial crisis in 2008 to 10, and then most recently COVID, did you notice that the volatility and the performance of wine stayed fairly constant?
Yes, it definitely, it doesn't, there is a very low correlation. So where during the economic crisis that you've mentioned, the movement of wine prices was, there was a dip, but it was significantly less than what you would see in other equities. And with COVID, obviously the opposite happened, where folks were sitting at home and had a lot of disposable income. So that was actually a catalyst for significantly increased consumption and price appreciation within the category.
Yeah, let's not talk about inflation. That's just too depressing for us. I'll leave that off the table for a moment. Well, one other attribute that I think is so interesting about wine is that it's the supply of wine, of a particular given wine, can only go down, right? There's only so much 1982 Mouton or 85 Sassicaia or something. So do you find that for older wines, those tend to be the more successful investments, just given that the quantities are always depleting?
That's one of the great things about wine as an asset class, is obviously it's a consumable good. And so supply drops over time. And it improves the quality over time as well. So I think that can definitely increase the desirability. And as the supply decreases, obviously the competition to acquire those products. For us, and the other thing that's interesting about wine is it's a relatively illiquid market. And so the way that price moves tends to be in more of a step change function. We see that happening at different age periods for different wines. We typically see price movement within the first number of years of release. And then, to your point, as wines really start to enter their drinking window and get consumed and supply starts to decline a bit more rapidly, then we see the price moving there. So we sort of look at those two ends of the spectrum as when we are looking to source and or exit assets.
So one other thing you just mentioned that I think is important is the liquidity or the illiquidity of the market. So for somebody who wants to unwind their position or sell things off, how does that work through Vint, and how does that work in general?
So with Vint, we manage the process from end to end. So the investor in a collection only needs to allocate to however many shares they want in an individual collection. Vint handles the storage, we handle the insurance, and we handle the exit. So there's no liquidity in the interim, but we see that as an advantage because the traditional approach, if you're going to invest in wine, you need to basically run the process from end. And this is a much more turnkey approach. In terms of exiting, we monitor the market. We monitor multiple markets. So we're looking at the European markets, we're looking in the US, tracking price movement, and ultimately looking for opportunistic exits in in multiple markets, with the objective of yielding the greatest return, obviously. Because of the illiquid nature of the market, we can often realize returns that are even higher than what we would expect sometimes, because again, there's this scarcity factor with some of the things that we're trading in. We might sell wines or spirits back to our merchant network in the UK or in France, and we also have this platform in the US, again, a marketplace, and the objective there is to increase our exits through that channel as a way to maximize returns for investors.
Now, this might be a real trade secrets question. So if you can't answer it, don't. But from where do you supply your wine? So if you're buying and selling back to merchants, do you also buy from merchants or from Chateau? Where are you getting it?
Yeah, we do. We buy from, we have a pretty tight network of trusted suppliers, but we work with merchants in the UK, in mainland Europe, both in France and other European countries. We source from negociants, we source from producers, and we also source spirits at auction. We don't source wine at auction at the moment, because for us, we want wines that are in their original cases. We want wines that have been professionally stored since release. And so, very concerned about provenance and storage for wine. Certainly concerned about provenance and authenticity for spirits, but we are more flexible in terms of how we would source those. And the secondary market is really driven by the auction houses as it relates to spirits. So those are our main channels.
Well, if you ever need intel on how certain wines have been stored, if they've ever come from anyone in inventory, we have that record of what's in their collection.
Yep. Excellent.
So talking about investable wines themselves, what is it that defines an investable wine? What makes a wine investment grade?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we like to say is not all wine is fine wine, and not all fine wine is investment grade. So I think people that approach the idea of investing in wine or collecting wine, sometimes initially they have this idea that if a wine can improve with age, that it will also go up in value. There's actually a pretty small number of wines that have a track record of increasing in value over time. And that tends to be our focus. So we tend to really look at the main fine wine categories of Europe: Bordeaux, Burgundy, Champagne, Tuscany, Piedmont, and then a little bit from Spain, a little bit from Germany, a little bit from the Rhone, and then emerging regions like Napa, certain producers from South America, certain producers from Australia. But our focus is pretty narrow, because we want to identify and focus on assets that have a track record of performance, or robust consumer demand, right? We think, again, the illiquidity sometimes with producers that don't have a long track record can really deceive you around what the potential is for future appreciation. So we tend to take a pretty conservative approach when we're defining those, what is an investment grade wine or spirit. And so that being said, even though our main focus tends to be these traditional fine wine regions and the producers that you might expect from those regions, we do also focus on what we call emerging regions or producers, where we really see the trends moving in the right direction in terms of consumer awareness. And we see these wines punching above their weight from a quality to price ratio. Again, for us, that's the smaller slice of what we offer. And we try to really communicate the thesis around those wines in a very clear way, so folks know, okay, well, this is again, just like if you're buying a stock, a stock from an emerging industry, the upside might be potentially larger, but there's also potentially more inherent risk there.
So how many producers in each region would you say would fall into this category? Let's just take a region like Bordeaux or Burgundy. Obviously, there will probably be more who fall in the
Yep.
investment grade category, but how many would you say? Is it just the first gross and the Grand Crus, or does it disperse down?
Yeah, I think again for us, our focus is going to be the first growths, the GCCs, the Grand Cru Class A, and their right bank equivalents. Even within the GCCs, we're looking at a subset of those. So again, one of the things that we really think about is where is the consumer demand and where is the awareness of these brands. So producers like Lynch Bage or Ponte Canet have very robust markets for these wines, and they're just known by consumers and in demand. So those would be kind of be core focal points, and then we're also looking at producers that might have that might be sort of undergoing some changes, both at the winery or around ownership or winemaking, and looking at some of those catalysts for potential price appreciation. So, Trollo Mondo or Parmo Brion are a couple producers that have been on the rise recently. So we're kind of watching those that are on the upswing and trying to take advantage of those opportunities as well. But, in terms of a number, I would say in Bordeaux, for us, it's maybe 30 to 35 producers. In Burgundy, it's probably 10 or 12. It's a pretty small number, I think, when you get right down to it.
Yeah, and I suspect even smaller when you get into Piedmont and Tuscany and Germany.
Yeah, absolutely. In Germany, I mean, for us, it would be Keller and Egon Mueller probably would be our main focal point. It's in Piedmont, handful of producers. And in Tuscany, I guess we're a bit more liberal there because of one, the way that we see the price movement of Tuscan wines tends to be earlier in the cycle. So they tend to appreciate more within the first 5 or 6 years of release. And it's a pretty significant category for us in the US. So the US being our preferred exit channel, we can take advantage of increased consumer awareness. And we also look to capitalize on arbitrage opportunities across these markets as well. So, the other thing that's interesting about wine is it's a very inefficient market. So where we have confidence in the demand for a category and we see arbitrage opportunities in sourcing from Europe and potentially reselling in the US, that might be something we would look at and consider a broader base of wines in that regard.
So how many lots would you have on Vint at a given time, and how many wines in the marketplace?
Yeah, the marketplace actually includes a lot of the assets that we've sourced for Vint, and it also includes wines and spirits from different sources of supply that we know and trust. So we've got over 10,000 individual products on our marketplace on there right now. The most expensive offering that we have right now is a bottle of Macallan Red Collection 78-year-old Scotch for $162,500. We've also got a bottle of 2009 Loire Musigny that's available for just over $100K. So it's we run the gamut from about $300 a case up to 6 figures. Yeah, and then around as it relates to Vint, we tend to offer collections sequentially. So we might have 2 or 3 different collections that are available for investment at any given time. We've done about 80 collections since our inception. First collection was offered in 2021. And we've also got a slightly different product that is available for accredited investors. That's a fairly new offering for us. And basically the idea behind these collections is they're very curated and focused. So there is a theme behind it. That could be Bordeaux. It could be a specific producer. So for example, recently we did an Haut-Brion offering that was Haut-Brion and La Mission Haut-Brion offering that was 18, 19, and 20 from both of those producers. We've done others that are focused on value producers from the left bank or the right bank, or it could be early, recent releases from Champagne. So there tends to be some idea behind how that collection is built and constructed. Each has its own investment thesis, so folks can understand what's the historical performance of the category, why do we put this collection together in the way that we did, and why do we think it's an interesting investment. So it enables people to build their own diversified portfolio over time through this sequence of offerings. With the accredited product, the idea is, folks that want to deploy larger amounts of capital in one go and get instant diversification can work with us and invest in these. It's called a Reg D offering, and that we basically constructed in such a way to give them exposure across different categories.
What would be the typical hold that you'd anticipate? Because you mentioned that you're always looking for exit opportunities, right, to generate the highest return. But what do you anticipate for most of these lots?
Yeah, so we guide to between 1 and 7 years for a hold period. We view it as a medium term investment. So I think 3 to 5 is going to be where the average hold sort of ends up. Although we've made a number of exits already. Again, just looking opportunistically where we can. We've exited, six different across 6 different collections thus far, and those have really been based on market opportunities that present themselves, and again, sort of the nature of the step change function and change in price is you can't exactly totally predict when that's going to happen, but when it happens, we want to pounce.
Let's talk now about bridging, collecting, and investing, because you spoke about this already a little bit. And as you know, most of our listeners are collectors. So how much does it help to actually understand wine and know the regions and know the producers as opposed to somebody who's more financially minded? Because we've spoken before and you've mentioned that most of your investors are actually just financial people. They're not collectors, right?
I think, there can be I think you need a bit of both if you're really looking at it as an investment. I think if you're passionate about a region and the producers within that region, you will get exposure to the producers that are ultimately going to be interesting potential investments. But I think if your focus is on investment being a bit more cold and calculated in terms of focusing on data and sort of detaching yourself from the passion can be very useful. So that's the approach that I try to take. Obviously, being a master of wine and having a lot of interest in the category is useful, but I try to take a much more sort of cold approach when I'm thinking about it when we're thinking about it for investment, and really focus on data, focus on historical performance and brand strength. So, I think just sort of having clarity around what your objectives are, and sort of creating that separation between what you're doing for passion and what you're doing for investment or expecting a return from is useful, just to ensure that you meet your goals and that you're ultimately satisfied with the outcome. I mean, again, I guess not the first person to say it, but the great thing about investing in wine, especially if you're investing as a collector, is that you'll have some great things to drink at the end of the day if it doesn't work out.
Now, speaking about what you just mentioned, that you are a master of wine, so you can recall all this knowledge about the different. If I asked you what are the main investable wines you thought of Bordeaux, you'd know them off the bat. For somebody who's a bit newer or is just an investor and purely financially focused, do you offer analyst reports or something like that give them that information that they need to make those assessments?
We do. We provide, for every collection that we offer, we develop a detailed thesis, which outlines the investment rationale for those collections. And that's for that individual collection. We also provide data around the historical performance, both of those individual assets when we have that. Some of the products that we offer might be brand new release, so you don't have any history, but we also provide other historical performance that we think is going to be relevant for investors. So we try to provide as much data as possible. And then we also really focus in on key points for each of the collections. So we think about the quantitative piece as much as we can, but there is also a qualitative element that we think about, right? So again, how is a brand trending in the market? What is the sentiment of the critics around a vintage or a particular producer, and try to really bring as much color as possible to light when folks are considering these investing in these collections. So I think that could be useful, again, just sort of for folks to orient themselves around the most important regions and at least what we consider to be the most important producers. We also produce quarterly reports where we provide commentary and data around what's happening in the market.
You find critic scores make a material difference or increase prices if they get high scores over time?
Yes, without a doubt, they do. It may not have an immediate impact on a brand, but I think if you find a brand that is highly regarded and collectible and has a track record of consistently producing high quality, the critic scores that sort of validate that over time have an impact because it increases in general of awareness of the trade and the consumer, which influences demand. And then if you look at individual wines within a producer's portfolio over a period of years, and you compare the wines that might have 100 points versus wines that get 97, there's no doubt an impact in price.
So some producers get pretty fired up about wine as an investment. I'm sure you know this, but why do you think that is? And how do you respond to that?
Well, producers mostly are making wines because they are passionate about their land. They're passionate about their product. They want people to enjoy their product and consume their product. So I think the idea of speculating on it just might feel contrary to their goals as somebody who's pouring their blood, sweat, and tears into making these fantastic wines. From our side, I think we view ourselves as caretakers of these products until they're ready to drink. The realities of the market is that nobody wants to hold these wines, or that the producers don't want to hold these wines until they're ready to consume, right? They just can't, because the cash flow, the realities of the business are just too challenging. Their intermediaries similarly don't want to hold and cellar these wines until they're ready to drink. So there is a value that we are providing by maintaining these wines in professional storage and caring for them until they're ready to consume. And I think that's better than putting them in somebody's wine fridge, right? And then those wines are going to be put on auction, and maybe that wine fridge breaks down for a few months in the summer, right? And then nobody knows it, right? The idea that we view ourselves as providing value and clarity in terms of provenance, and ultimately want to put these wines in the hands of consumers at the end of the day, which is one of the reasons that we've launched this marketplace. So I definitely understand some of the hesitation, but I think we're doing it a bit differently.
Now let's turn to some trends in wine. What are some trends that you're observing in wine as an investment right now?
Well, I think what's interesting is some of the price appreciation that we've seen among certain categories is having an interesting impact across other categories. So as an example, we are very interested in Bordeaux as a region right now. Again, many people wouldn't be surprised by thinking of Bordeaux as an investment, but it has really, Burgundy has had a lot of the spotlight recently, and the pricing of many Burgundies has accelerated quite significantly. And the same has happened in other regions, like Tuscany has been on fire as well over the last number of years. The reason I think that has created value opportunities in Bordeaux. So, Bordeaux by comparison, now there are certain producers that are inexpensive or great values from a quality price perspective that maybe weren't considered or viewed as such a few years ago. So for us, we're really interested in kind of refocusing on Bordeaux for the relative value proposition that it provides. Also very interested in specific vintages of Bordeaux, 2018, 2019, and 2020. Again, in the context of how the quality of those wines compares to historical vintages, how the prices of those wines compare to the most recent on premier releases. We see a lot of value in 18, 19, and 20 Bordeaux. And the market availability of top wines from many regions is just more limited than it ever has been. I think part of that is due to increased consumer demand, but also just trends with weather cycles has really created unpredictability and caused production levels in general to decline across a lot of these regions. So I feel like we've got some structural supply imbalances here that will be favorable for price movement in the future.
Tell us what sort of happened with those main regions over the last, let's take 10, 15 years. What happened with Burgundy? What happened with Bordeaux? What happened with Italy? What happened with Champagne? Can you give us just a little snapshot? And what happened with Napa? Let's go through the main regions and give us a sense of what's happened with those ones.
Yeah, well, I think with Bordeaux, the top chateaux have just become increasingly well capitalized, which has given them the tools to produce wines to produce very good wines, even in challenging vintages. Obviously, we have these trends of warmer vintages more frequently. So there are more vintages that I think are kind of considered high quality recently, but then they've also just got fantastic tools, and they've also got the ability to implement different protocols to make very good wines even in challenging vintages. So quality is continuing to rise. As they become more well capitalized, I think the pressure to sell these wines earlier has decreased. So we're seeing less wines being released as futures, more wines being held back for library releases in the future, generally kind of cleaning up the market as a whole. And I think that kind of bodes well for price movement as well. You have less wine sort of sitting out there at retail at lower prices, maybe in retailers that aren't necessarily positioned well to sell these wines, and a cleaner market will probably facilitate price movement faster. In Burgundy, just an incredible increase in consumer awareness and demand across many of the kind of major wine consuming countries. So I think many of the Asian markets have increased focus on Burgundy, as well as continued development in the U.S. and there's just tiny amounts of wine being made. So you just got an intense focus and interest on very small volumes that are being produced, which is causing prices to go through the roof. And producers, I think, are starting to catch on a bit around, what their wines are commanding in the secondary market, and I'm seeing some trends where folks are just getting more judicious about allocations and smarter about allocations, which I think is a good thing. Producers should. They're not. I don't think they're greedy, but I think a more rational approach to their release prices will probably restrict the incentive or limit the incentive to immediately go out and resell these wines on the secondary market. So and producers should capture more value, I think, to the extent that that's possible. Champagne and Tuscany, I think, have both grown very strongly over the last number of years. Again, strong relative value proposition when you consider those wines versus Burgundy and Bordeaux. The Trump tariffs had a big impact on those categories in the U.S. market in particular because they were not impacted. So there's a lot more consumer demand in the U.S. on those wines. But yeah, I think folks are the rising prices of Burgundy in particular and Bordeaux has just caused these other categories to increase in visibility and demand.
Interesting. And now, are there any regions that you think are ones to watch from an investment perspective?
We like South America, some of the top wines in South America. So we've done a few collections around the icon wines of South America, like Benya, Cheval de Andes, Cloapalta. We liked them, one, because from a quality to price perspective, they punch way above their weight. And the association with producers that have global reach, I think, is also very helpful. So a lot of the top chateaux in Bordeaux have these joint ventures or outright ownership of properties in South America. And so they're leveraging, the cachet that they possess for their own brands to marketing these wines, but they're also leveraging their global distribution network to build awareness. So I think those are really some exciting wines for sure.
And delicious.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Well, so what's next for Vint? What do you see as your big milestones over the next 12 months?
Yeah, so for us, we launched this marketplace a few weeks ago, and that's gaining traction. We're really excited about that. We think that it's, well, at least in looking at our assortment versus what else is on the market, we think we've got one of the most compelling assortments of collectible fine wines and spirits in the U.S. for sure. So really excited to see the great response we've been getting on that so far. For us, the collections will continue to be a focus, but reaching accredited investors and institutions is also very important for us through these diversified offerings. And then we are also exploring ways in which we can work with producers and solve problems for that producers face. Again, this our CEO Nick talks about this duration mismatch in the wine space, where again producers can be very cash flow constrained in certain periods of the year, and kind of thinking about how we can solve these problems through different funding opportunities. So yeah, we see ourselves as, very focused on wine and spirits as an asset class, but also problem solvers within the industry, and looking to really create this suite of services that touches all parts of the supply chain.
Interesting. Well, I hope that goes well. That sounds like a great initiative. I like what you said about your company being both caretakers, but then also being actively involved in helping suppliers and producers solve these issues. So it's nice that you've managed to bridge those two, and I'm sure that makes your MW heart happy as you're able to use those skills you've developed.
Yeah, it does. I think there can be the industry is so interesting, and in many ways very traditional. There can be a tendency to accept things the way that things are because that's the way they've always been done. And I think we're trying to take a fresh approach, sort of from end to end, with how we're going to market, but also really looking at some of these problems and pain points that producers are feeling, and seeing if we can find some solutions that are a win-win.
I was hoping one of the things you were going to say about a Vint milestone is Vint Canada, since we're up here, so we're a little excluded. But you keep me posted when that happens.
Yeah. The tariffs are a little bit painful these days, but we'll have to talk to Trudeau and see if we can sort something out.
Awesome. Well, Adam, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful episode. If people want to learn more about Vint or connect with you, how can they do that?
So our investment platform is www.vint.co. And then we've also got this marketplace, which is vintmarketplace.com. Loads of information on both platforms about the company, how we operate it. One of our key focal points is transparency. So providing as much information as possible about how we operate and in giving folks confidence in how we go to market is really important to us.
Thank you again so much for joining us. To all of our listeners and viewers, thank you for tuning in. And please don't forget to subscribe and leave a review and any feedback on episodes you'd like to hear more about. And to learn more about inventory or start managing your collection, go to inventory.com. And of course, go to vint.co. I got that right? Vint.co?
You got it. Yep.
Perfect. And go check out what Adam's doing over there. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks again, Adam.
Thanks, Eula.